Hey everybody, I'm Teryn Darling, and you are listening to the Tatter-a-Fact Podcast here at Girls Inc. in Las Vegas. Welcome. Happy to have you. Today, I'm going to be talking about pigment dilution. I'm going to share how and why I started diluting pigments, and I'm going to talk about the science behind it. Why and how it works, and when diluting pigments could be a really awesome and amazing technique for PMU artists to use in their own work if you're not already. I've been wanting to do an episode on pigment dilution for a long time, so I'm really excited to be talking to you about this. Diluting pigments is something I've been doing my entire career. I learned how to dilute pigments in my body tattooing apprenticeship and work. So about 25 years ago, I started at the Skin Factory with Eddie Lynn. And Eddie Lynn was a versatile artist. He could do color, all kinds of different styles, but black and gray, portraits, realism, and biomechanical work was really his big love and what he excelled at. And I think before I started at the Skin Factory, when I would see a black and gray portrait tattoo on somebody, I think I just thought they were using different gray inks to create all those different hues of gray. I mean, it never dawned on me that they were taking black and diluting it into different percentages to create all those different shades and hues of gray. So that was really cool for me to learn, to watch Eddie do. And back then, you're talking 25 years ago, ink lines didn't have a set of shading solutions, meaning black ink already diluted at the manufacturing level for artists to buy. Artists were diluting their black ink into their own custom percentages. So I learned how to dilute black ink from Eddie. He had his own percentages, very particular to him. And he had 5 different percentages. So he would have his black ink and then 5 different dilutions of that black ink at very specific percentages to create very specific gray hues. So I started doing it. I started making my own gray shading solutions for my own body tattoo work that I was doing. So I had one leg in body tattooing and one leg in PMU. And back then, they were 2 very segregated industries. There was no, they didn't overlap at all. At all. Body tattooing really, the body tattooing industry, or at least the artists I knew, really didn't understand the PMU industry and what we were doing and the way we were working. And to be honest, they didn't like us very much and made fun of us a lot. And then in PMU, way back when, the trainers and leaders during that time were very anti anything body tattoo. Like, they just did not agree with using body tattoo machines for any permanent makeup procedures, any body tattooing needles, body tattooing nothing. You had to use permanent makeup machines. You had to use permanent makeup needles. And back then, those permanent makeup devices, machines, were like $20,000 for Pete's sakes. The needles were $20, $25 each. And, you know, it was just very different times back then. So it was really, at first, things made sense to me, right? I mean, I go to the body tattoo shop and I'm using a coil machine. I'm using tattoo needles. I'm making tattoo needles because Eddie made all his own needles, and all the artists in that shop made their own needles. I had to as an apprentice, and just kept on making them because I enjoyed it. So, you know, a really great coil machine in body tattooing was like $250. You could adjust the stroke setting on it. And needles, you could get a box of 50 for about $25. But then, you know, during the day, I'm doing PMU procedures, and the machines are $15,000, $20,000. The needles are $20, $25 each. When I would eye loop the needles, they weren't near the quality as the body tattoo needles. And I was just struggling, right? My work was healing in one session with all my body tattoo work. It was great. I was super stoked. But yet with my permanent makeup work, it was taking like 3 sessions to get all the healed in saturation I needed. 3 or 4 sessions, especially for lips. That was the norm. That it was just accepted. That's just the way it was. It took 3 or 4 sessions. I remember going to a lip class because I was really struggling with lips. And the teacher saying, hey, it just takes 3 or 4 sessions. That's just the way it is. And I don't know, something in my little brain that just didn't sit right with me. And I started discussing it with Eddie. And Eddie was like, yeah, that doesn't make sense, man. You know, skin is skin. So why don't try using the coil machine? Just adjust it to hit softer. Why don't you use our needles? I mean, skin is skin, and approach it the way I've taught you to approach tattoo work. You know, use the movements I've taught you, use the needles you're making, use the coil machine. You know how to set that coil machine to a 2.5 or 3-point stroke so it hits the face a whole lot softer. You know, and play around, Teryn. Explore. It's skin. And so Eddie kind of gave me the motivation and the courage to do that. So once I started doing that, I went from one issue where my work was not healing in with my PMU procedures. I was losing the majority of it during the healing process, and it was taking me 3 sessions, if not more, to now I'm using larger needles, right? Because before that, I was using 3 and 5 RLs primarily. That's all I was taught. Every now and then I'd use a 1 RL, but primarily I was using 3 and 5 RLs for everything in PMU, brows, eyeliner, lips, everything. And one kind of movement, which was kind of like a pendulum scratching kind of movement. And in body tattooing, of course, we're using larger needles. We're using 8 shaders, 14 shaders, 7 mags, 11 mags, 22 mags. So I started incorporating those tools, the coil machine, the larger needles, and the movements into my PMU work. And as I said earlier, I went from one issue to another. And that was my work was not healing in well, and it was taking me 3 sessions, to now all of a sudden I'm using the larger needles. I'm using the hand movements that I use in my body tattoo work. I'm using the coil machine, and now everything's healing too solid. I'm like, oh my God, I went from one extreme to the other, like almost overnight. And both issues, like one issue is not better than the other. Both issues were super stressful, right? If your work is not healing in for a client and they have to keep coming back and back and back, well, that's embarrassing. That's stressful. The client is now starting to doubt your skill, and that's a whole issue that you have to deal with. But my gosh, if one session, that color heals in too good and it's too dark and it's too solid, well, that's not good either. And now you have another whole set of issues. Now the client's not happy because the brows are too solid. It looks like a tattoo. It looks like a big old sticker. And, it wasn't good. So I went from one extreme to the other, and I had to find a middle ground. I had to work my way towards the middle. And that's where dilution became a really important part of the way I work. I incorporated dilution because I didn't want to go back to having my color not heal in well in 1 to 2 sessions. I really liked that. My clients liked that. I got done my procedures much quicker using the larger needles. But I can't have my color healing in too solid, too dark, especially for clients that are requesting low saturation, soft and powdery. So dilution, that was the key. And I took everything that I learned from Eddie, creating black and white, black and gray tattoos, to my eyeliner work. First, that's where I started. Using pigment dilution was with my eyeliner work. And so I started diluting my black. And I was using LI at the time, Onyx, and I started diluting it. And lo and behold, once I started diluting black for some of my eyeliner clients, it healed in super soft, smoky, and dusty. So I started playing with different dilution percentages, like Eddie had for his black and gray portraits. I started playing with different dilution percentages because PMU pigment is different than body tattoo pigment. Remember, in body tattooing, they're using really super strong black carbon. In eyeliner work, I was using PMU pigments, and I was using carbon on some clients, of course, on a lot of clients, but I was using LI pigments, carbon, and it wasn't as strong as body tattoo, carbon. And then on some clients where I was worried about migration, I was using iron oxide black. So I had to play with the different percentages and get them just so. And that took me, 2 or 3 years and, quite a few eyeliners. And then I kind of honed in on my percentages. So I have 4 percentages that I created and I've been using for the last, 15, 16, 17 years now. I can remember when I started telling my PMU friends and colleagues back then that I'm diluting pigments. for my brow work, my eyeliner work, my lips, especially lips. They thought I was absolutely crazy and out of my mind. Like, why on God's green earth would you want to dilute pigments, Teryn, when it's taking, 3 sessions to get any color to heal in, And keep in mind, back then, pigments, PMU pigments were made less concentrated. They were weaker. Over the last 20 years, pigment manufacturers have increased the concentration levels, right? They're learning new technologies. They've done a lot of things with pigments to keep up with the industry. Because the industry is changing. Our needles, our machines, our tools, the way we move, what we want to create, everything's evolving and rather quickly in PMU. And so pigments need to evolve right alongside the pigment industry, or they become obsolete. And LI Pigments has been very good at that, keeping up with the industry. When I was creating my OMG pigments, there was a lot of things that I had to take into consideration, and I'm going to dive into that a little bit further. But let's stay with my PMU peeps thinking I am absolutely crazy diluting my pigments. And they did. They thought I was crazy because it was unheard of. Nobody was really doing that in PMU. No one. But once I started employing larger needles and the hand movements that I was using in my body tattoo work, I had no choice but to start utilizing pigment dilution so I could create soft, natural, powdery, healed-in results. I could have gone back to the 1, 3, or 5RL and created those soft, powdery looks. But again, with the pigments back then being less concentrated, I didn't want to go back to taking 3+ sessions to get all the healed in color a client was requesting, especially if that client was requesting a more saturated, bolder, healed in result. I just didn't want to go back to that. I am somebody that wanted to work with efficiency. For me personally, I believe in working super efficient. I'm a critical thinker. I want to work smarter. I want to utilize the tools and techniques that deliver the best results with the least resistance. I want to use the tools and techniques that give me the advantage, right? I don't want the skin to have the advantage. I want to have the advantage. And that's really important to me, especially when I'm working on skin that is super oily, bleeding, and resistant to accepting color. So I didn't want to go back to the smaller needles, especially on skin that was challenging. I wanted to stay with the larger needles. And by larger needles, for me, that meant I wanted to use a 5 shader for my eyeliner work, and I wanted to use an 8 shader for my eyebrow work, and I wanted to use a 9 or an 11 mag for my lip work, which is perfect needles, right? Because those larger needles pick up and implant a lot of pigment, which is great, especially if the client is oily, bleeding, and resistant. It's great, especially if that client wants a more striking, bolder, higher saturated look. But what if that skin is normal to dry, takes pigment good or too good, and on top of that, they want a low saturated, soft, powdery look, right? So that's where dilution for me is key. I have to dilute pigments, especially on skin that takes pigment well, when my client is requesting a soft, powdery look. So, anyway, my colleagues thought I was crazy until I started teaching the technique all around the United States, teaching the larger needles, lecturing on larger needles, lecturing about dilution, doing hands-on training. That's how my training kind of started. I think they were kind of fascinated back then with the way I worked. So it ended up being like a really cool thing. I met a lot of cool people, and to this day, a lot of those gals and artists from 20 years ago are my good friends and colleagues and permanent makeup sisters to this day. So, what does adding a dilution solution do to a pigment? What does it actually do to a pigment? Well, number one, it changes the consistency of a pigment, right? It makes the pigment thinner and less dense. When a pigment is thinner and less dense, that allows for a smoother and more controlled application. We've learned that over the years. Now, back in the day, 20 years ago, artists liked a thicker, creamier pigment. So that's what manufacturers made. It's certainly what LI made. LI was really popular. LI's always been really popular. But back in the day, and even up until like maybe 7 or 8 years ago, we were a thicker, creamier pigment. We were really much thicker 20 years ago because that's what the industry wanted. And it made sense with the way the industry worked back then. But now we're using different machines, different needles, we're using different movements. The industry has evolved. So manufacturers, including LI, have made their pigments, thinner and more fluid. When I was creating the OMG pigment line, I had to decide on the viscosity or the consistency, if you will, of the OMG pigments. And, what I learned is you can't please everyone. And that's a hard pill for me to swallow because I'm the type of person where I want to please everyone with my product. When I come out with a product, I want everyone to love it, and that's just not realistic. You're not going to please everyone. So I had to come up with a consistency that was going to please and work fantastic for the majority, right? For the majority. There's a song, you can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself. Well, I did not go into formulating OMG and deciding on its consistency to please myself. I wanted to please the majority. And I did please the majority. Yes, there are a few artists that wish I had made the pigments thinner. And there are a few artists that wished I had made the pigments thicker. But the majority of artists, the larger percentage of artists, love the viscosity or consistency of the OMG pigments. The reason I think I made the right decision because, and I thought about this when I was formulating the OMG pigments, if I make the pigments thicker, a little bit thicker, and you're an artist that prefers a thinner pigment, well, that's great. Because you can just add a drop of dilution solution and thin it out. Add a drop or two of dilution solution and thin it out to your exact likeness. You can customize the thinness, the consistency, if you want it a little bit thinner. no problem. But if I had come out with a thinner version, if I had made the OMG pigments too thin, and you're an artist that just does not like really thin pigments, well, then you're stuck. You're stuck. There's nothing you can do. You can't add a thickener. And I wouldn't be able to give you a suggestion or help you out in any way. So the OMG pigments would not be for you. They just would not be your cup of tea. But again, if I had made them the consistency I did make them, which is kind of like this silky, fluid consistency, yet for some artists, they're a little bit too thick. You wish they were a little thinner. No biggie. You're not going to be mad. You could just add a drop or two of dilution solution and get that consistency as fluid and as thin as you want. So I thought that was the best way to go. And the OMG pigments are super duper concentrated. So you're not going to really lose any strength by adding a drop or two of solution to thin them out. So number one, it changes the consistency, thins out pigments. Number two, when you add dilution solution to a pigment, it dilutes the pigment concentration, right? It dilutes the pigment concentration. It is going to make the pigment less concentrated. How much dilution you add depends on how much the concentration is reduced. So the dilution reduces the number of pigment particles in that pigment cap. Hence, every drop of pigment you implant into the skin, and that softens the overall effect of the healed-in look. Number three, it affects the opacity. It adjusts the opacity. It reduces the opacity. So full strength pigment, opaque. You start adding dilution solution and you start reducing the opacity, meaning you start creating a more translucent effect, which leads to a softer healed-in result. So think of it this way. In your bedroom, you can hang drapes that are solid and don't allow the sun to come in to your bedroom. Equate that to full-strength pigment that is opaque. Or you can hang a set of shears on your window, which are more translucent and will allow sunlight to come into the bedroom. That equates to our pigments and how adding pigment dilution reduces the opacity of our pigments. The more solution you add, the higher you dilute, the less opaque that pigment will appear. The more translucent or transparent it will heal in the skin. So everything we do has science behind it. Whether it's skin, of course skin has science behind it. Color theory, our needles, our machines, our hand movements, just our wound care, healing process, everything we do, all our tools and products, there is science behind it, which marries with the artistic side of it. So that's why I think our industry and what we do is so cool, because it's a marriage of artistry and science. And when we pair artistry and science correctly, then magic happens, right? So there is science behind dilution. How does diluting pigment, affect the pigment, and why does it work? Well, number one, I'm kind of being redundant here. I'm going to repeat myself, but it reduces the pigment load. It reduces the pigment concentration, as I just mentioned previously. Fewer pigment particles are deposited in the skin because we diluted the pigment, right? So fewer pigment particles are deposited in the skin, and that results in a lighter and softer healed appearance. So now we're going to bring in some real science. We're going to talk about light dispersion. Lower pigment concentration, right? When you have fewer pigment particles in the skin, when you dilute pigment, that separates, spreads, or scatters the pigment particles. So when you have pigment particles that are scattered or spread out more in the skin, that allows more light within the skin, making the healed result appear softer. Right? So a good analogy is pantyhose. If you take a pair of black pantyhose and you just kind of hold it up and you look at them, no tension on them, you just hold them and you look at them, they're black, right? Actually, put a quarter underneath those pantyhose and you can't see the quarter. Those pantyhose are black. It's dense color and it's black, and you cannot see the pantyhose. But if you start to stretch those pantyhose, what happens to the black color of the pantyhose? It gets less black, less dense. And the more you stretch it, the less black it gets. It actually starts becoming more gray in tone, and the color becomes less dense, and you can see the quarter now. And that's because you're stretching or spreading the pantyhose. You're spreading the color. So that equates to pigment particles in the skin. When you dilute pigment and you implant diluted pigment into the skin, those pigment particles are spread out or scattered into the skin, which allows more light, which makes the healed in pigment heal and appear softer. It increases the transparency of the healed in pigment. Diluted pigment allows light to pass through the skin. And again, that creates a lighter effect, a much lighter effect. It also allows more of the skin's undertone and overtone to shine through the pigment, to be visible through the pigment, right? Which creates a natural soft look. Now, that can sometimes work against us, right? There's going to be some cases where you don't want to highly dilute the pigment because of what we see on the overtone. You don't want to do that if someone's ruddy, if there's a lot of freckles, if someone's like super pink, because if you highly dilute pigment on skin like that, then all that pink skin, freckles, ruddiness, it can be seen through the pigment. So on some skin types, we do want a more opaque pigment. We do want a more opaque look to cover up what's existing on the overtone or undertone. And then in some cases, the skin is perfect skin to highly dilute pigment and allow the natural undertone and overtone to be seen through the pigment. And that will create just this beautiful, absolutely beautiful, soft, powdery effect. You create the same kind of look, not diluting pigments, using a 1RL and doing light saturation. This is just a different way to create that look using larger needles and dilution. So kind of cool, right? The science behind it. The connection between dilution and science is really super cool for me, but I'm a PMU nerd. Okay. So a question that I get a lot when it comes to diluting pigments is, does diluted pigment last as long as full strength pigment? And yes, it does. 100% it does. And some people, they'll question me on that. And I love the questions, right? You should ask a lot of questions. That's how we learn. And I'm under the belief that the only question the only dumb question is the question not asked. That's how I learned a lot. That's why I am a PMU nerd, is because I asked a lot of questions. I've got to wrap my brain around things, right? Because I'm tattooing people's faces. And I know what kind of results I want for both my client and myself. And I have to understand stuff. I have to understand the science behind it, the why behind it, and then I got to a place once I understood it, I wanted to be able to explain that to other artists so they could understand it, and that's how I became a teacher. So diluted pigment does last as long as full strength pigment. Yes, it does, and here's why. It comes right down to the permanent makeup pigment properties. The pigment properties. The pigment's durability and the pigment's light fastness, it doesn't change just because it's diluted. Let me say that again. The pigment's formula, its durability, its light fastness does not change just because the pigment's diluted. You're just spreading out the pigment particles. You're not weakening the light fastness of those pigment particles. You're not weakening or taking from the high quality or performance level or durability of those pigment particles. The light fastness, durability, stability, and performance of those pigment particles remain. You're just spreading them apart by adding dilution solution. Another reason diluted pigment will last as long as full strength pigment is the body treats the diluted pigment particles in the exact same way as undiluted pigment particles, right? We have these things in our bodies called macrophage. I don't know if I'm saying that right, so forgive me if I'm not saying it right. Macrophages, right? However you say it. Don't beat me up on that one. But our body has those things, and they're like Pac-Man, and they eat up and gulp up pigment particles. And the body treats the diluted pigment particles the exact same way it treats non-diluted pigment particles. Nothing changes. The body doesn't change the way it treats pigment particles, whether it's diluted or not. The particle size of the pigment, that doesn't change, right? The actual pigment particles remain the same size and composition. Adding dilution solution doesn't change that. It doesn't change anything about the quality, the size, the durability, the performance, or the light fastness of the pigment particle. Nothing. That all remains the same. Okay? So, that is why, and that's the science behind why diluted pigment will last just as long as full strength pigment. And then if you want to go back and talk about the macrophages and the behavior of macrophages, macrophages can only remove so much pigment over time. So the pigment remains stable in the skin even when diluted. So the stability of the pigment, the longevity of the pigment is not affected just because it's diluted. So as long as the pigment we're starting out with is of high quality, made with high quality, top tier raw colorants that have high light fastness, as long as that pigment is deposited at the proper depth, upper dermal layer, it will maintain the same amount of longevity even when diluted. Now, I will admit something. When I first started diluting pigment for the eyebrows, eyeliner, and lips for my clients, I wasn't sure if it would last as long as my procedures that I was not diluting. I really wasn't sure because the internet wasn't really around and all this information wasn't really around. So I did learn that just from experience, just from working on clients and all that. And I did a lot of clients. And just from, collecting data and watching my clients age over the years, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of clients age over the years, with brow, eyeliner, lip, and areola pigments that, I diluted and, were not diluted. So, and now we have amazing science and knowledge right at the tips of our fingers that we can access to better explain why. I knew I was experiencing that. I knew from experiencing diluted pigment, even highly diluted pigment, lasted as long as full strength pigment. But back then, I really couldn't have told you why. I just knew it was. But now I can explain why, which is really cool, and which just shows you we're always learning, right? Which sounds so cliche sometimes. You're always learning. We're always learning. But boy, isn't that true. Boy, isn't that true. I'm always learning. So that is the science of pigment dilution. Kind of cool. Kind of cool. So if you're not already diluting your pigment, like when are some good examples of when you could dilute your pigment, or maybe you should dilute your pigment? I guess there's not a should. Well, there is a should in some cases, depending on what pigment you're using. But in most cases, it's not really a should, unless you're using larger needles like me. You don't really have to dilute pigment. If you're working on skin that takes really well and they're wanting low saturated, super soft, dusty brows, you could always use a 1,3 RL. And you don't have to dilute your pigment at all. You can whip shade that in and don't dilute your pigment at all. But if you're an artist that wants to stay using larger needles and create that soft, dusty, super powdery look, and you're working on pigment, skin that takes pigment really, really well, then that's when the should comes in, right? You probably should dilute your pigment in order to create that soft, powdery look. So smoky eyeliner, that would be a great example. Diluting your pigment is perfect for clients seeking a subtle, natural, dusty, what does Christina call it? Stardust effect. And keep with using larger needles. Again, you can switch to a 1 or 3 RL and create that look. But if you're an artist that just does not work well or enjoy the 1 or 3 RL, and you prefer larger needles, you just do better work and are more comfortable with larger needles, then to create that super soft, dusty eyeliner look, dilute your pigment. It's perfect for that. And there are some artists, like we're all different. We're all really different people and different artists. And some artists are going to just take to that 1 and 3 and 5 RL very quickly. And they're just going to become so skilled and so amazing with those needles and create such beautiful work. And there are some artists that I know personally that can use a 1 RL and get really good saturation, and they're not spending 3-4 hours, right? They've really dedicated themselves to that 1 and 3 RL, and they've mastered it, and that is just their needle, man. And they don't prefer the larger needles, and that's who they are as an artist. And then there's artists that try like hell to master that 1 and 3 RL. They try whip shading and the pendulum movement, and they're just getting frustrated. You know, it's just not working well for them. And they move on over into larger needle groupings, like a 5 shader, a 7 or 8 round shader for brows, maybe a 5 or 7 curved mag, and voila, that needle just feels right to them. Instantly, they just start doing better work. That's their needle. You know, maybe they start doing more oval movements rather than whip shading movements. And that's just working for them as an artist. There's all different types of artists. People, personalities, and artists in this industry, and we're all going to find different tools, needles, machines, and hand movements that work best for us. And those are going to vary. But that's what I think is so cool and interesting about artists and the PMU industry. And I know that there is a small group of artists out there that can kind of beat you up, give you some shit, make fun of you, call you out, tell you all kinds of bullshit. If you're not using what they're using. But I do believe that's a small group of artists. I think most artists in this industry love the versatility, as I do. Love the versatile artistry and all the different ways that artists choose to work, all the different types of needle configurations and hand movements artists choose to use to create their beautiful work. I think most artists are like me and really appreciate and respect that. I mean, madly. I know I do. I have my own particular way of working. I think everybody knows the way that is. I'm very open about it. I talk about it. But I have mad respect for those artists, and some of them are my dear friends, that just can tattoo the shit out of brows, lips, eyeliner, anything with that single and that 3RL, even on, bad skin. I just got the most, utmost respect for you. I just can't do it. I just can't do it. I just don't have the patience for it. I think personality comes into play, with the tools we end up liking to work with and what we end up being good with. I think personality really does come into play a little bit with that. That would make sense. So another example of using dilution, lips. If you're an artist that you don't want to use the single needle or 3RL on a lip because it's just taking you too long, right? And you're getting frustrated, but you want to create that lip tint or lip blush, you can use a larger needle. You can use a 14 round shader. You can use a 7 or 9, curved mag, and just dilute the pigment. Dilute the pigment. That's what I do. I choose to stay with a larger needle, but I do have clients that want that lip tint look. They want a super soft lip blush result. And so I cannot achieve that using full strength pigment with my hand movements and the way I work and my larger needle groupings. So I have to highly dilute pigment in the way with the way I work in order to create a super soft lip blush healed in result. Brows, creating that ombre effect in the fronts. A lot of artists are using singles and 3RLs for the entire brow, and they just do less passes in the fronts to create that ombre look. And then there's artists that use an 8 shader or a 5 shader for the whole brow. And then when they get to the fronts to create that ombre, they switch needles. Then they'll switch to a 1 or 3RL and whip out those fronts to create the ombre and low saturated look. And then there's other artists that will use a 5, 7, or 8 round shader through the entire brow. They don't switch needles. And when they get to the front of the brow to create the ombre look, they use highly diluted pigment. So that's just another cool way that dilution can play a really valuable role in the way you work. So one more example I'll give you is creating gradients and layering techniques, which is what I love to do. I love to layer. So a lot of times my first pass, like when I'm doing areolas, I'll lay down like super diluted pigment, and then my second pass, less diluted, and then my third pass, hardly diluted at all. I do that sometimes with the brow. My first pass will be full strength pigment, and by the time I get to my last pass, it's highly diluted pigment. So, and then you can do gradients. You can blend diluted pigment into non-diluted pigment to create a blend or a super buttery gradient. So there's lots of different ways to utilize dilution in our work, in all of our work, whether it's brows, eyeliner, lips, areolas, and even camouflage work. So it's pretty cool for me to think that I played a small role in bringing dilution over into the PMU industry almost 25 years ago. I'll be celebrating 25 years, a quarter century, this coming September. And God's honest truth, when I started using diluting my pigments all those years ago, really, all my colleagues just thought I was absolutely crazy, including my mentor, Marjorie Grimm. They had never heard of it. It just thought it was the most bizarro thing in the world. And I wasn't sure if they were right or not. I knew it worked in body tattooing with body tattooings. I wasn't quite sure it would work with PMU pigments and PMU procedures. So I felt I was being a big risk taker back then. I was being a rebel. And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of people did look at me as a little bit of a rebel, certainly a disruptor back then, without intending to be. Sometimes the word disruptor comes with what's the word I'm trying to say? Bad condemnation. And I think, and that's not always the case. Sometimes disrupting the way things are done is necessary. Sometimes it's really positive and brings about positive change and new ways of doing things. And disruption can be done with grace and allow a new generation of artists to explore and expand on the way they work. And I think that was me all those years ago. You know, I know I've certainly have had a lot of people talk to me about that and mention those kinds of things to me. And it's really humbling to hear that. And so I'm really, really, really proud of that. So let's just talk about soft effects for a moment. So soft effects, LI Pigments was the very first permanent makeup pigment manufacturer to create a solution dilution. Very first manufacturer, and that's because I was using LI Pigments and I was their distributor, and I told them to. I asked them to. And because before LI Pigments made a dilution solution, I was using sterile eye wash, right? It was very common back then to use either sterile eye wash or witch hazel, right? My body mentor, Eddie, used a combination of both. And so when I first started using dilution for all my PMU procedures, I was using sterile eye wash as the dilution solution. Worked great. It's sterile, super safe. But the problem with that, and it wasn't really a problem with me because I was used to it, is that the pigment settled to the bottom of the cap very quickly. So you constantly had to stir it. And if you didn't constantly stir it, like every 10, 15 seconds, when you dipped, you were dipping in nothing but sterile eye wash. So when I started teaching this technique all those years ago, it was hard for artists first learning this technique to remember to stir constantly. And that presented a problem because they weren't getting the healed-in results that they expected, and because they just couldn't remember, or a lot of them couldn't remember to stir constantly. Almost every time you dip, stir, because it just separated so darn quickly. So I asked LI, almost as soon as I became a distributor, I asked them if they could create a dilution for pigments that would keep the pigment from separating. And they did. They did. We went through quite a few samples, and it took quite a bit of tweaking, but they ended up creating the most perfect dilution solution that when you mixed it with your pigment in your pigment cap and you gave it a good mix, that it kept the pigment suspended with the solution. It didn't separate. I still recommend, maybe every so often, especially if you tend to take longer to work, to give it a good stir, maybe every 5 minutes. Give it a good stir every 10 minutes. Just give it a good stir. But it was the solution that I was looking for, and it allowed learning dilution, pigment dilution, and getting good results much easier for newer artists. So, through the course of many samples, many adjustments, and many clients, we got Soft Effects. That's what I named it, Soft Effects. We got that to be the perfect blend, the perfect percentages of water, alcohol, and glycerin. You don't want too much of one and too less of the other when it comes to those three ingredients. It's got to be the perfect percentages of each. So it's a very simplistic formula, yet there is complexity to it because it's got to be the perfect percentages. So I do have some exciting news that I want to share with you. So, I started my OMG brand, Teryn Darling's OMG brand, and we started with my eyeliner pigments. And that made the perfect sense. Perfect place to start, because I do a lot of eyeliners. And now I've got my 4 brow colors out. I've got a new brow color coming, which I'm super excited about. It's a much needed color. I cannot wait to get that out to you. I'm currently working on my lip colors, my OMG lip colors. 3 are done. I'm still not quite happy with 2. I'm still tweaking those, but those will be done in the near future. And I got a couple of other products that are going to be very useful and beneficial to the PMU artists that I think are going to help you with your work, with your healed in retention, coming to the OMG brand. So I was on the phone with Darlene, the owner of LI, and we were talking about, the OMG brand and all the stuff that I'm doing. And she said, Teryn, I've been thinking. All those years ago, 15 years ago, when you became a distributor for LI, you had me make Soft Effects. And now that you have your OMG brand, and it's growing, you're growing it, I think Soft Effects should move over into the OMG brand. You came up with the idea, you tested it, you signed off on the formula, and you named it. Actually, Kat named it. My wife named it. Soft Effects. She goes, so I think you should move that over into your OMG brand and line of products. And I just about cried. I couldn't believe she was saying that to me. I couldn't believe I was hearing that. And I'm like, well, what are you going to do? She goes, I'm still going to have dilution solution. It's just going to be under the LI label. It's going to be LI Pigments Dilution Solution. Simple. But that Soft Effects, that name, that's yours. And I want you to take that over into and under the OMG brand. So, so a big, huge thank you to Darlene Story for being so generous and blessing me with that. I just, how cool is that? Really, really cool. I'm super excited. So it's still going to be Soft Effects, but it's going to be on the pink OMG label. Nothing has changed about it. Same ingredients. Use it the same way, same everything. It's just under the OMG brand. And Soft Effects, you can use with any pigment. Any pigment. We formulated it to be used not with only LI pigments, but to be used with any pigment line. I know there are some pigment lines out there that say you can only use their solution with their pigments, but that's not the case with Soft Effects. Soft Effects can be used with LI, and it is perfectly safe and okay to use it with any pigment. So I just wanted to put that out there. So final thoughts. Let me get a drink of water first. Final thoughts. If you're not already experimenting and taking advantage of pigment dilution, give it a try. I encourage you to give it a try. You will be absolutely amazed how much versatility, how much control it gives you in creating stunning PMU results, custom results. Custom results. Let me know your thoughts. And thanks for listening today. You know, we clip off little clips of each of these episodes and we post them on Instagram. So I'm going to have this clip, this final thought clip, posted on Instagram. And I want to know your thoughts on pigment dilution. Are you already diluting your pigments? How are you using it? How did it change the way you work? And if you're not already diluting your pigments, after this episode, are you ready? Are you ready to dive into pigment dilution and start creating custom tones and custom results? All right, you guys, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I appreciate you. I wouldn't be here with you. So thank you for listening. Until next time, stay in the pursuit of happiness.